I've been seeing quite a few comments lately from people who are irritated, to put it lightly, about several things in MOTORFEST, and I absolutely hate where the conversation seems to be going, so hopefully in this video I can make some good points and maybe change how people view and think about this game. Let's go! Real quick before I get into the video, if you're looking for any of my MOTORFEST tunes or my Need for Speed Heat builds, I've moved everything to my website. It's militiagamingco.com. There's links in the main navigation menu for Need for Speed Heat builds and MOTORFEST Pro settings, so click those if you're looking for that. The link to the site is actually in the description of this video. Alright, enjoy. Fairness is something that most people can get fired up about easily, and it's easy to think something is unfair when you aren't winning, or in some people's case, when you're losing by a lot. The average Grand Race lobby nowadays sees maybe half of the field finishing the race. The rest get DNF'd, and honestly, oftentimes more people DNF than finish, which means the majority of the players who are playing it are not necessarily having a good time. Then you pile on top of that not so good feeling the fact that the top players in the race are taking shortcuts, performing resets or sometimes double resets, and have packs of players who are queuing into grand races together that just ends up being a slipstream train that completely leaves the field behind. The current racing environment is definitely a recipe for creating upset players, especially players whose skill level isn't quite there yet. But the question that I have today is, at the end of the day, is it fair? Does every player in the game have this same opportunity to do well in a grand race? Let's talk about each of these things that upsets people first, and then I'll talk about some things that I think Ivory Tower can actually do. Number one, resets. Resetting your car is a mechanic of the game. Its intended purpose is to help you get back into the race after going off course or maybe getting stuck somewhere. However, players have figured out that it actually can be used to avoid slow corners and are now using it for a competitive advantage over players who simply do not know its benefits or are refusing to use it out of principle. First of all, if you're choosing not to use a game mechanic that you know will allow you to go faster out of principle, you cannot complain about players using it and beating you. You are intentionally putting yourself at a disadvantage, then being mad that you can't overcome it. Just stop doing that. If you're a player who doesn't know about the best reset points, that's the same thing as not knowing what gear to be in for a particular corner or not knowing how fast you can take that corner. It's just track knowledge and it comes with time, so just keep playing so you can learn. The main goal of this channel actually is to help people get faster. So just consuming the info that I'm feeding you and you'll learn a lot. Number two, shortcuts. This also falls under track knowledge, but in my opinion, people who are complaining about these are even more wrong. Ivory Tower has intentionally added shortcuts to this game because they're fun to discover and navigate, and they add a layer of depth to the overall racing experience. Shortcuts offer players who take the time to learn them a reward for leveling up their track knowledge, and the game was designed that way. Honestly, I'm gonna lose some of you with this statement, but if you're complaining about shortcuts in the Crew MOTORFEST, you just need to play something else, because it's a huge part of the Crew franchise's DNA. And that's honestly okay. I prefer you guys to play things that you're actually having fun at, and if you're not having fun at MOTORFEST because of shortcuts, then you definitely should play something else. Number three is slipstreaming. Now obviously, I don't think people are complaining about a couple random players slipstreaming together. That's a common racing tactic and it should be used. I think what people are upset about is when you have a group of players who have queued into a grand race lobby at the same time with the intention of racing each other, who end up just dominating the race by forming a slipstream train at the front, and that leaves behind the main pack of the race and basically DNFs the entire lobby. I can understand why that's frustrating, but it's definitely not unfair. Those players are literally just racing to their best of their ability, and they can feed off of each other using slipstream and drag bump. But you know who else can take advantage of that as well? You. You have just as much an opportunity to tack yourself onto the back of a big slipstream train as anyone else in the race. If you aren't able to, it's because you aren't fast enough to stay attached, which is also fine. You can and will get faster if you just keep playing and trying to absorb all the information you see. And number four, this is a very popular one for some people, abusing meta, or as I like to call it, using the fastest cars in the game, where being fastest is exactly the main objective. Listen, you're free to use whatever cars you want, but knowingly using something that's slower and then complaining about other players using something that's faster to win is absolutely ridiculous, and it's certainly not unfair. Now, let's talk about some things that I think Ivory Tower does need to address that make the playing field unlevel. The first is the performance difference between console and PC. In general, the console versions of the game do run a little bit worse, and that's something that IVT can and should fix. It is completely unfair and none of the players are at fault. I think the community is right to be upset by this because we do all need the game to be running at a very minimum of quality in order to perform good. If you're losing a bunch of frames in a grand race, how are you going to be steering your car correctly when you really can't even see the turn coming up? In addition to that, there's also an issue with input devices. Wheels are faster than controller and keyboard due to their exact one-to-one steering that they offer. Controller players on PC have figured out a way to have that same exact steering on controller, which they've called wheel mode, and it leaves console players who prefer a controller over buying a $200 to $300 wheel behind. It's a problem that I actually plan to cover in a future video because it requires a bit of a nuanced conversation, and I don't want to make this video 20 minutes long. In the meantime, you should take a look at Goliath's video that explains the problem really well. There's a link in the description of this video for that, but the bottom line is that in a racing game, the input device, aka the wheel, the controller, the keyboard, should not be the thing that separates you from your competition. It should be your driving skill, and as of right now, particularly at the top of the leaderboards, wheel players and controller players of equal skill are not able to perform equally, which is the definition of unfair. So at the beginning of this video, I asked the question, is the Crew MOTORFEST fair? And my answer is, unfortunately, not completely. The biggest issue in the fairness argument, in my opinion, is the game's performance in PvP environments across different platforms. Consoles, particularly PS4 and PS5, have had a really rough go since launch, and that's a big enough section of the player base for me to consider the game a little unfair. That being said, the rest of the things I talked about are literally just excuses for why someone isn't racing better, and you should try your best not to get wrapped up in people saying that those things make the game unfair. Learn the routes. Learn the shortcuts and the resets, attach yourself to the back of big slipstream trains, and use the free resources at your disposal like the content on this channel or lots of others that will definitely make you better at the game. Anyways, if you agree with me and you find my content helpful or entertaining, over 70% of you guys are not subscribed, so please consider it as it does help me continue to do this full time. I really do appreciate everyone's support. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Trigger out.